Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Hear the word of the Lord. When Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a bright robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus, the one of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go, say to his disciples and to Peter that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him as he told you." And going out, they fled from the tomb, for trembling and bewilderment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. If we did not understand the concept of bewilderment, we definitely learned its meaning in the last 15 months or so. 15 months ago, we didn't really understand what this virus was. We heard all sorts of conflicting information about a pandemic, claims of what it meant and how to safely carry on our lives. We heard conflicting messages about masks, about prophylactic measures, about potential treatments, about keeping our distance, about what it meant to gather in safety and how we could proceed with carrying on life in a world suddenly turned upside down with so much uncertainties. We didn't know where to look for guidance. Our scientists were busy scrambling, trying to figure out what was happening with this novel virus that was not acting in a way consistent with so many other viruses that were already known. We still don't really know what we would like to know. We're still uncertain as to the future. We still don't know past vaccines and masking and all the different things going on about variants and the need for a booster, for a vaccine. We don't really know how life will proceed into the future. There's so much that is unknown. Bewilderment seems to have become the state of life for us in so many regards. We don't know how to plan when we do not understand what is right before us. That is, there is no clear path. So how do we march forward when we are bewildered? Mark's gospel ends here rather abruptly. It seems to take us through the life of Jesus, and we arrive at this moment to hear the wonderful news of Jesus' resurrection, and Mark ends on a discordant note. It's shocking. It's bewildering. It leaves us wanting to know more. It leaves us with more questions than perhaps it answers. We know that there is more to the story, obviously. Mark would have needed access to these women's memories to be able to put down for us a record of their bewilderment and fear, leaving the tomb, saying nothing to anyone. We know this is not the last bit of the story. We know that the gospel does not end here, and yet Mark was very intentional about ending his story right here. It made people uncomfortable. It caused them to question themselves, but it left them on this discordant note. And the early church wanted this, but they wanted something more. They wanted a message of hope. They wanted to get beyond this bewilderment, this being stuck on a note of uncertainty. We don't like bewilderment. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like the unknown. We want hard, fast answers. We want to see hope painted out for us in bright colors that capture our attention, that give us the strength and courage to march forward with full confidence. And yet life often comes at us in bewildering patterns. It sneaks up on us and offers us a confusion of messages in which we do not really know how to move forward. We can see no future. Members of the early church took Mark's account and they drafted a couple of alternate endings, and his gospel began circulating with some of these, two of which sometimes find themselves in copies of our text of Mark's gospel. Additions to Mark's account to leave us on some other note, fully aware that Mark wanted to end his gospel account here, open-ended, causing us to pause, to reflect upon our stake in Jesus, our stake in the gospel, and causing us to reflect on how we will march forward. Will the message end in bewildered inaction on our part? Or will we get beyond our bewilderment, face it down, and march ahead with whatever God has in store for us? As uncertain, as unpromising, as unlikely as it may be. The disciples were woefully unprepared for Jesus' death. Sure, Jesus had mentioned that he would die, but they were too ensnared by this concept of Messiah as a military, political leader who would lead Israel into its golden age, surpassing that of King David. Messiah was supposed to put Israel back on the map and as something akin to the Roman Empire, a force to be reckoned with. A land where people would come from all parts of the earth to seek out knowledge and certainty and understanding from Yahweh. Messiah was supposed to bring Yahweh's reign and presence upon the earth in a way that drew all peoples to Jerusalem as the center of all civilization. Jesus' death on the cross annihilated such a concept. The disciples had come to understand that Jesus was indeed Messiah. And with his death, their hopes, their dreams, their faith, their certainties, everything that they had staked their lives upon came crashing down around them. These women were no exception. They had latched on to Jesus with a certainty that he was indeed God's Messiah, Yahweh's path forward. if they had simply looked upon Jesus as a ethical, moral teacher, as someone who is coming into Israel's life as a prophet along the lines of Moses or Elijah, they could have grappled with his death, accepted it as some inevitability that the world would turn against the prophets of Yahweh. They could have marched on. But what we find is that they are at a total loss. Because Jesus for them was more than simply an ethical teacher, a religious leader, a prophet coming to explain the ways of Yahweh in a way that was much more clear than they had seen heretofore. Jesus for them was Messiah. And Messiah could not die. Messiah had other roles to fulfill. Messiah had to usher in the kingdom, the reign of Yahweh in unprecedented ways. And sure, they had seen Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead, but they had no real expectation that Jesus could die, much less come back to life. Jesus' words about this notwithstanding, it ran so hard against all of their tradition that embracing the concept was oh so difficult, upsetting, bewildering. Jesus was supposed to remain present with them in flesh and blood, was supposed to become king, was supposed to establish God's reign in a powerful and visible way. And yet when he turned himself over for death and crucifixion, their hopes and dreams came crashing down around them. These women were going through the motions of grief. They were doing the things that one must do when a loved one dies. This was women's work. Preparing the body, cleaning it, dressing it, anointing it with spices to obey the stench of death, that friends and family might come to pay their final respects. And there had been no time to do this on Friday evening with Sabbath approaching at dusk. So they had purchased the spices that they needed. They gathered their supplies and they made their way early Sunday morning to the tomb. Everything was not planned out well. They still didn't know how they would manage to enter the tomb, asking themselves en route, well, who will roll the stone away? How will we gain access to the corpse that we need to prepare? But when they arrived, the stone was already rolled away. Bewilderment expanded. They entered the tomb, and here is a young man seated in the tomb, dressed in bright clothing, Mark says. Says, you seek Jesus, the one from Nazareth who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen. Behold, here's the place where they had laid him. Now go, tell Peter and the rest of the disciples that he goes before you into Galilee, even as he said he would. The women are uncertain how to process. There's too much to process. Jesus wasn't supposed to have died. But now to hear that he is alive, that he is risen, suddenly not only do they need to grapple with the fact that Jesus died, but that their entire notion of Messiah either was completely off track or Jesus was not Messiah at all. And they had accepted not only that Jesus was Messiah, but that Jesus was something more than Messiah as they had imagined. Some had gone so far as to make the claim with Peter, "You are not simply Messiah, you are the Son of God." They simply didn't know how to process all of this. They didn't know what to do with this information, how it should impact their lives, how it would carry them forward, and what they could possibly do with it now. They didn't know how to make sense of a world turned completely upside down. So their first response was to flee. Mark says, trembling and bewildered. Saying nothing to no one because they didn't know what to say. They didn't know what to believe. They didn't know how to respond. And yet at some point along that route in which they were fleeing, silently arguing in turmoil within themselves, we know from the other gospel accounts that they did make their way back to the other disciples. Still uncertain. Reporting on what they knew, on what they had experienced. And trying to find a new way forward, where Jesus might lead them still. It was a tall order. Today's parlance, it was a very big ask. Women who were not accepted as worthy witnesses to speak in court, given charge of this greatest of messages. He is not here. He is risen, and lo, he goes before you, even as he said. Amid their turmoil, they had to stop and pause. They had to go back and review what they knew of Jesus, what they knew of Christ, what they knew of the one they had come to call Messiah and understand as God's Son living among them. To move past their bewilderment, they would have to open themselves to something new, unexpected, a different way of being and living and anticipating God's action in their midst. Bewilderment is difficult. If for nothing else, it means that we have clung to something that is insufficient. Our understandings of the world, of God, of ourselves, of faith, of our religious practice somehow needs to be analyzed further. We are called into something new and greater. Are we open to God as He calls us into a new chapter? It is the only way past our bewilderment.